The relationship between Jonathan and David gets a great deal of airtime in Scripture and has inspired many remakes in the Bible's literary and artistic afterlives. In recent years, it's taken center stage in online discussions as more Christians and Jews wrestle with whether same-sex love is compatible with Judeo-Christian values. My objective in this presentation is not to make claims about the relationship between the historical Jonathan and David, for there's no way to verify such claims one way or the other. Nor do I intend to argue whether or not same-gender loving readers can find themselves in this story. Indeed, they already have. Rather, I would like to show how the story world of David and Jonathan both invites us to bring our concerns to the text and simultaneously evades our attempts to nail down interpretation. In this particular story, we will see how provocative language and ambiguous social and political dynamics create an elastic, expansive narrative space for moral reflection. This discussion will fall into 4 parts. First, I will offer a brief narrative framing of David and Jonathan's relationship. Second, we will review a very select history of reception of this relationship in scholarship, art, and literature. Third, we will take a close look at the biblical story to see for ourselves what is and is not there. And finally, we will consider what social, political, and ethical work the story may be doing. In order to appreciate fully the relationship of David and Jonathan, it is important to remember the frame, which is not only the much larger story of David's rise to kingship, but a story larger still of how and why Israel eventually suffers defeat and deportation at the hands of the Babylonians. Moreover, David and Jonathan are not presented in isolation, but are embroiled in a literary ménage à trois of sorts. The primary conflict takes place between Saul and David as they vie for the throne. As Saul's son and David's loyal friend, Jonathan is the connective narrative tissue between these two rivals. The Bible, of course, seems to convey an expressed preference for David, and biblical commentary, for the most part, eagerly follows suit, providing us with literary explanations and theological rationales for Jonathan's mediating position. Jonathan's affection for David, along with that of Michal, brings David into Saul's family, giving him a plausible place in line for the throne. Jonathan's allegiance to David, in light of his father's paranoia, intensifies the dramatic conflict between the divinely rejected Saul and the divinely chosen David. And Jonathan's love, however it is construed, prompts him to step graciously, conveniently, out of the path of David's divinely ordained rise to kingship. In short, Jonathan's character gets absorbed into the Saul-David plot, as he does what Saul cannot bring himself to do. Namely, he abdicates the throne, ending Saul's dynasty before it ever begins. Jonathan himself justifies David's rule as God's design for Israel's future. Throughout the history of reception of this text, however, the focus has primarily been not on ancient politics, but on the value of friendship. In devotional and poetic literature, Jonathan's self-sacrifice has garnered the lion's share of admiration. In his lengthy treatise on spiritual friendship, the 12th century abbot St. Elred of Rievaulx advocates friendship as the highest of Christian virtues, warranting martyrdom if necessary. He highlights Jonathan's selfless devotion as a model to be emulated. This most loving youth held fast to the oaths of friendship he had sworn, stood up to the threats, endured the insults, and disdained the kingdom for the sake of friendship. Careless of the glory he would miss, but mindful of the integrity he would keep. Here is a true and perfect friendship, solid and eternal, a friendship that envy does not corrupt, suspicion does not diminish, or ambition wipe out. It does not cease even under a trial. Even under such a battering, it does not collapse. Assailed with abuse, it stands firm. Beaten with insults, it does not bend. Go thou and do likewise. In the Renaissance, Jonathan's self-sacrifice was lauded as a component of ideal Neoplatonic friendship, a relationship governed by complete trust, consensual aims, ambitions, and attitudes, and the willingness to sacrifice self and possessions for one's companion. In his 1656 work, Davidice, a sacred poem of the troubles of David, English poet Abraham Cowley praises Jonathan as a, quote, true friend to David, even when a crown flattered and Saul threatened, who nobly remained David's friend, though it meant the loss of a kingdom. In the fourth book of the Faerie Queene, subtitled Of Friendship, poet Edmund Spenser lists true Jonathan and David among well-known pairs of ideal Greek companions who were known for their incorruptible devotion, chaste virtue, brave thoughts, and noble deeds. For John Winthrop, founder and governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Jonathan and David provided the ideal model of Christian charity. In his programmatic treatise, written aboard the Arbella in 1630, Winthrop insisted that the kind of charitable behavior that he envisioned for the new colony was acted to life in Jonathan and David. Jonathan, a valiant man endued with a spirit of love, so soon as he discovered the same spirit in David, had presently his heart knit to him by this ligament of love, so that it is said he loved him as his own soul. This love always receives with advantage. Among the members of the same body, love and affection are reciprocal in a most equal and sweet kind of commerce. This comparison of Jonathan and David's friendship with Christian charity also emerges 200 years later in the work of Quaker minister and folk artist Edward Hicks. Though here the mutual sweet commerce gives way to a somewhat unbalanced affection, underscored by the juxtaposition of the two young men with the Good Samaritan and his injured foundling in the lower right corner. Treatments in the modern era have carried a similar theme. The relationship between Jonathan and David has been construed as fraternal devotion or brotherly love, often in tension with a larger authoritative social framework. Brotherly love under the pressure of familial authority is a motif taken up in William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. Critical commentaries have tended to highlight the military context and to portray the relationship in terms of the fidelity expected of a comrade in arms, a political ally, or even an alter ego. Particularly popular in the World War II era and post-war 1950s, This kind of framing became standard in biblical literature targeting children. Subsequent depictions will do away with the military backdrop completely, and there will be a reemergence in popularity of Giovanni Conegliano's 16th century depiction of David and Jonathan taking a leisurely stroll through the countryside, with David casually swinging Goliath's head. Thanks to fineartamerica.com, this image is available these days not only as framed art, but on stationery, phone covers, coffee mugs, t-shirts, beach towels, face masks, and even baby apparel. This rendition will inspire a host of Bible illustrations that depict a darker-haired, darker-complexioned Jonathan gazing intently at a fair-skinned and blonde David, whose eyes are focused on the road ahead, as if envisioning a glorious future. But not all interpretations have put the two young men on equal standing. In their educational handbooks, Renaissance Christian humanists approvingly cited Jonathan's relationship to David as an example of princely behavior, a sentiment echoed more recently in a contemporary commentator's description of Jonathan as a real nobleman of high sensibility. In artistic tradition, Jonathan's noble status has had prominent play, typically indicated by age, body position, gesture, and attire. Rembrandt imagines an elderly, princely Jonathan responding to a deferential David. Gustave Doré, whose magnificent woodcuts made the Bible a bestseller in 1865 France, projects a regal Jonathan protecting a David who seems to be collapsing under the weight of his predicament. And contemporary Asian Christian artist Hu Chi draws upon his cultural experience to envision Jonathan as a ceremonial warrior whose awesome demeanor compels court musician David into submission. Jonathan's relationship to David has, at least in the eyes of some, been governed by strict socio-political parameters and conventions, lending credence to the notion that his love is that of a political patron and protector. This is indeed borne out by the fact that the word love, in Hebrew, ahav, is commonly found in suzerainty treaties across the ancient Near East to express the political fidelity of cultural groups to their imperial overlords. It is, coincidentally, this understanding of love that is reflected in the book of Deuteronomy, which mimics the vassal treaty of Assyrian Emperor Esarhaddon. One should love the Lord your God in the same way that one should love the Assyrian emperor who exacts tribute and threatens retribution. Throughout the history of interpretation, there has also been substantial attention to the homoerotic dimensions of the text and its portrayals of characters and their relationships. The sculptures of David by Michelangelo, Donatello, and Verrocchio portray the beautiful boy David as the object of the male gaze. Poised just before the confrontation with Goliath, in the case of Michelangelo, or just after his slaying, the sculptures of Donatello and Verrocchio, the nude and partially nude Davids stand in the homosocial world of military combat. They occupy the narrative moment when all the men of Israel and Philistia would be fixated upon the lithe body of the young man David. Many painters, too, dwelt on the beautifully seductive boy David as he, post-combat, contemplates the dismembered head of Goliath. Here are but a few examples. Indeed, these exquisitely sculpted and painted Davids invite a different reasoning for Goliath's downfall, as the poet Richard Howard has supposed. Perhaps the giant was a bit distracted by the lovely boy swinging his stones. The initial love of Saul for David has also invited queer reading, as suggested in this painting by Swedish artist Julius Kronberg, and made more explicit in this rendition by an unknown artist from the Flemish school. The attachment between David and Jonathan, however, has probably attracted the most attention. There are several adaptations of this romance involving varying degrees of social equality and hierarchy. The common argument found in popular culture construes David and Jonathan as actual historical personages who shared a mutual and open affection between them. Artists focusing primarily on the initial meeting of the two, or their painful parting, have often rendered the relationship as reciprocal and candid. Writers of fiction have explored erotic entanglements. In his 1906 play Saul, Nobel Prize-winning playwright André Gide portrays both Saul and Jonathan to be smitten by the young virile David upon his arrival at court. East German novelist Stefan Heim depicts David as the lover of both Saul and Jonathan in his politically controversial The King David Report. Post-Holocaust writer Greta Weil, in her novel The Bride Price, depicts the relationship of Jonathan and David as a source of tension between David and Michal. Some scholars have seen in the relationship between Jonathan and David a variation on well-known mythic relationships, for example, that shared between Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the Gilgamesh epic. Others have argued that the story of David, Saul, and Jonathan is a neutral, unapologetic literary reflection of ancient homosocial, particularly military, culture. Yet others have focused upon David's feminization of Jonathan in his famous eulogy, and have either taken that at face value or have understood the relationship in the context of the text's pro-David political agenda, which elevates the manlier David over the womanly Jonathan to strategic political effect. In the end, Jonathan's desire for identification with David, reciprocated or not, politically fabricated or not, compels Jonathan to act against his own interests, in the felicitous expression of David Jobling, to empty his heirdom into David. Or as Mark George has phrased it, David assumes the body of the heir apparent, in both text and artistic tradition. Treatments more theological in nature tend to ignore the homoerotic possibilities and to set the relationship, particularly Jonathan's affection for David, in the frame of divine providence. Here, the text's claims of divine preference for David are commonly met with compliant acceptance. It is not uncommon to see the most critical of commentaries genuflecting to the text's message that Jonathan's selfless abdication to David inevitably serves God's greater plan. Gently nudged, and in the spirit of Winthrop and Hicks, the valorization of self-sacrifice slips across the testamental divide. Jonathan's devotion to David is compared with following Jesus, or even with Jesus' own passion, which also has a history of being couched in terms of friendship. After all, no greater love hath any man, claims the writer of the fourth gospel, than to lay down his life for his friends. Thus, for many, a logical connection is forged between Jonathan's friendship to David and Jesus' friendship to all humankind. For example, in a 1950s volume devoted to church school education, we read, "The love of Jonathan is in a way a prototype of Jesus' love for humanity. It was a stooping, bending, self-emptying love, such as the Master of Men expressed when he divested himself of glory, left his heavenly Father's home, and came to this earth to become the friend of man." It is not uncommon to see this tact still employed in church school curricular materials in more evangelical branches of Christianity. Consequently, we find the relationship of David and Jonathan serving a number of ideological, political, and theological ends, both within the story world of 1st and 2nd Samuel and beyond. However that relationship is construed, whether platonically, hierarchically, politically, homoerotically, or self-sacrificially, the pro-David slants of both the Bible and subsequent tradition seem content to leave Jonathan leaning forward, yearning for, forfeiting family and future for David. What might we find if we take a closer look at the biblical text itself? The story, in fact, starts with Jonathan, despite the fact that Jonathan is rarely considered apart from David in the history of reception or scholarship. Because we tend to read proleptically, with knowledge of the important figure David will become, we often fail to consider that there were other viable leaders in Israel's past, and that those heroes too had a following among the populace and a special place in cultural memory. We remember the story as David's story. Other characters are supporting cast, foils, friends, helpers, providing the backdrop and advancing David's plot. Nevertheless, the Bible does afford us, before David commandeers the stage, a momentary glimpse of a Jonathan detached from either friend or father. In 1 Samuel 13 and 14, we see a Jonathan who acts independently with such courage that Saul pales by comparison, and David himself is hard-pressed to surpass it. In 1 Samuel 13, Jonathan assassinates the Philistine prefect who is occupying Israelite territory. In 1 Samuel 14, he and his arms-bearer attack a Philistine garrison. As many commentators have noted, Jonathan's initiative, assertiveness, and daring contrast sharply with the sedentary, cautious, hesitant Saul. While Saul sits under a pomegranate tree, apparently stymied by a lack of weaponry and warriors, Jonathan and his arms-bearer scramble up a cliff face and wreak havoc on an entire company of Philistines. Indeed, if, as Robert Alter suggests, A character's first words indicate significant aspects of personality, then Jonathan's first speech act alone sets him apart from his father. When stymied in his search for his father's asses in 1 Samuel 9, Saul's first utterance had been, "Come, let us go back." By contrast, Jonathan's first words are, "Come, let us cross over." If the frequently sitting Saul is plagued by hesitation, retreat, and distraction, Jonathan waits for no one, seizing opportunities as they present themselves. Cross over he does, fighting first a terrain of thorn and tooth, then a garrison of taunting Philistines. By contrast, Saul fiddles around in camp, calling roll to identify the absentee warriors and attempting to consult the ark for guidance about what to do. And if Jonathan's confidence in the face of his father's tentativeness fails to establish sufficiently the disparity between the two, the next episode sharpens the contrast. Saul puts the troops under the threat of curse if they eat anything before he is avenged of his enemies. Jonathan, however, either not hearing or simply not heeding the oath, eats honey discovered in the forest and is reinvigorated while the rest of the soldiers grow faint. When confronted with Saul's oath, Jonathan openly criticizes his father's policy. While such an oath before battle may reflect a common custom, Jonathan insists that it is impractical and short-sighted. His father, he claims, has troubled the land, accusatory language that puts Saul in the inauspicious company of Achan, Jephthah, and Simeon and Levi, characters all notorious for impetuous behavior, bringing death to innocent victims. Upon discovering the oath's breach, Saul clarifies the terms of the curse. Infringement of the oath is a sin. The penalty is death. When Jonathan is found to be in violation, he explains unapologetically what he has done and offers himself. "Behold, it is me, I will die." The people, however, will have none of it. Should Jonathan die, who brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Absolutely not, they insist. As Yahweh lives, not a hair from his head will fall to the ground. Perhaps, as Jan Folkelman suspects, the people are starting to sense Saul's impending madness. Or perhaps, as Walter Brueggemann supposes, not everyone shares Saul's brand of piety or his view of what serves public interest. Whatever the case, the public protest indicates popular allegiance shifting from Saul to Jonathan. By transferring admiration from father to son, the narrator may indeed be utilizing the glaring differences between the two to lay the groundwork for David's appearance and promotion. The next step, as David Jobling has pointed out, is to transfer admiration from Jonathan to David, which Jonathan himself takes the lead in doing. However, in addition to presenting David as the object of Jonathan's affection and loyalty, the narrator has the more arduous task of establishing David as a credible competitor to Jonathan's valor. To accomplish this, the narrator is forced to import Goliath from some other hero's story, that of Elkanah in 2 Samuel 21, and to make remarkable claims for David's offstage activity, such as killing lions and bears and procuring 200 Philistine foreskins from, we presume, highly resistant Philistine soldiers. But despite the narrator's valiant efforts to push David into the spotlight, Jonathan's exploits in 1 Samuel 13 and 14 challenge the centripetal force of David's personality and the common presuppositions regarding the text's stance toward him. Jonathan is the protagonist for a day. Time slows to accommodate his feats and to allow an unobstructed view of the ways in which he relates to political oppressors, to fellow soldiers, to his father, and to God. This brief portrait presents a young man who fights oppressors because they are oppressors, who, unlike David, does not calculate personal gain. A leader who, unlike David or Saul, does not ask his troops to do anything he's not willing to do himself. A leader who, unlike David or Saul, has earned and can rely upon the support and protection of his followers. A son whose loyalty to his father also accommodates correction, critique, and confrontation. A religious person who values but does not bank on divine favor, and who, moreover, is not paralyzed by divine silence. "Who knows," he says, "maybe the Lord will act for us." The stubborn memory of his heroism casts a critical shadow over David's character and reign, suggesting an ancient community more politically divided and theologically mixed than we commonly allow. In chapter 18, Jonathan ends his solo career. His life, in Hebrew, nephesh, becomes bound up with David's in more ways than one. At this point, David has just killed the Philistine giant without the help of Saul's proffered armor and has been brought before the king. By the time David finishes speaking with Saul, Jonathan's nephesh, usually translated soul, is bound up with that of David, and Jonathan loves him as his own nephesh. The Hebrew word nephesh, however, does not signify some kind of entity that can be separated from the physical body, as it often does in Christian discourse that has been highly influenced by Greek philosophy. Rather, nephesh literally means a bundle of appetites, of desires, of one's life force, if you will, the involuntary impulses that motivate us to survive, to protect ourselves, and to perpetuate our species. In short, Jonathan's desires are, his life force is, bound up with the life and desires of David, and he loves David as he loves his own life. In traditional literature, this exorbitantly ticklish language is tamed into terms of mutual friendship, a move that has its analog in recent English translations. The New English Translation flatly states, "When David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan and David became bound together in close friendship." The New International Version, with its customary Christian slant, is not above resorting to evangelical cliché. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Both translations suggest a mutuality that is far from apparent in the Hebrew text and include any erotic, emotional, or political meanings commonly noted in critical commentary. The text itself raises multiple questions. Is Jonathan's life bound to David's in the same heart-rending way as Jacob's is bound to Benjamin's after the loss of Joseph? Does the binding kashar of Jonathan to David foreshadow the two's future conspiracy, kashar, against Saul? Does the binding, as does the word love, connote political allegiance and patronage that the heir apparent now extends to a special subject? Does Jonathan love David the same way Michal loves David? Is Jonathan's identification with David the narrator's attempt to set up David's eventual replacement of Jonathan? Whatever the language connotes, it does not reveal how David feels about Jonathan. The most we can glean is that whatever sort of bond Jonathan is offering, David accepts. Why he accepts, we are not told. Further clouding David's response is the way in which Jonathan's bond and affection is narratively entangled with Saul's co-opting of David's service. The text jockeys David back and forth between Saul and Jonathan, embedding Jonathan's regard for David in Saul's conscription of David, creating a web of political and personal patronage that David would be foolish to refuse. In the course of a few verses, Saul interrogates David, Jonathan loves David, Saul detains David for his service, Jonathan cuts a covenant with David and gives him his military gear, Saul puts David in charge of the troops. Saul provides the opportunities for David's advancement, while Jonathan equips him for success. Initially, David's success means success for the house of Saul and Jonathan. But as David's popularity grows, Saul increasingly views him as a rival, which spurs Jonathan to mediate between his father and his friend. By chapter 19, Saul's jealousy and suspicion of David begins to spill over into his public discourse within the court. As Saul speaks somewhat vaguely about killing David, the narrator reports that Jonathan delighted in David exceedingly, or alternatively, was exceedingly mindful of, or attentive to, David. The rich nuances of this language teeter between personal pleasure and political investment, and Jonathan's prior covenant with David also stretches his motives for informing David of Saul's intent into the arena of responsible patronage. Consequently, Jonathan's incentives for protecting and defending David are linguistically stained with both personal fondness and social obligation. Jonathan's willing intervention on David's behalf is commonly observed in discussions emphasizing the degree of his loyalty to his friend. Indeed, the repetition of son and father language underscores the competing relational claims on Jonathan as he attempts to bring about a reconciliation. What is usually missed in such lessons is the way in which Jonathan reasons with his father. The king should not sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you. Rather, his deeds have been exceedingly good for you. He took his life in his own hands and struck the Philistine, and Yahweh brought a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw and rejoiced. Why would you sin against innocent blood to kill David for nothing? Several things are worthy of note. First, although he speaks to Saul his father, he addresses him as the king, which casts the entire exchange in a political key. Second, he cuts straight to the heart of the matter, bluntly labeling Saul's intended action as a sin without excuse. Third, he appeals to Saul's political self-interests. David's successes have been good for both Saul and the people. Finally, he returns to and intensifies the language of sin, stressing innocence and killing for no reason. Jonathan's argument is driven by concerns for royal justice and the good of the people, not unlike his critique of his father in 14:29 and 30. There, Jonathan rightly observes that Saul's decision was not made with the welfare of the people in mind. Here, Jonathan points out that not only would the killing of David be a detriment both to Saul and to all Israel, but that kings should not be in the business of killing loyal subjects. Jonathan builds upon, even embodies, the theme inherent in the people's initial request for a king. In 1 Samuel 8, the people ask for a king who will do mishpat, administer justice for them. Jonathan is not only holding his father, king, to this standard of justice, he is enacting by pleading the cause of the innocent, the justice one should expect from a king. Persuaded by the arguments of his son, Saul relents, only to be stirred again to violence sometime later by an evil spirit from Yahweh. Seemingly unbeknownst to Jonathan, Saul has, by the end of chapter 19, attempted on 3 different occasions to have David killed. In 1 Samuel 20, David, in his first recorded speech to Jonathan, must convince the unbelieving Jonathan that Saul devises evil. He invents a ruse to expose the king's true sentiments. Rather than confront his father directly, as he does in chapter 19, Jonathan is persuaded by David to lie to his father regarding David's absence from court. It is, as Robert Poulsen notes, the first and only time Jonathan engages in any but the most straightforward of behavior, and he does so at David's direction. The depictions of David and Jonathan in this chapter are highly ambiguous. While David's desperation seems genuine, and his insights on Saul more apt than Jonathan's, we clearly see him capable of deception, and we wonder, along with Poulsen, if such duplicity might characterize his relationship to Jonathan as well. Jonathan himself seems naive about his father and easily manipulated by David. Or a more idealistic spin might praise his trust of both father and friend. One might, however, imagine, along with Barbara Greene, a more complicated Jonathan who, in the course of chapter 20, learns a painful lesson about the extent of his father's ambitions for him and what it means for one's friend to be the enemy of one's family. We might even suspect that Jonathan is not as oblivious as he first appears to the machinations of both his father and his friend. After having nearly died at his father's command in chapter 14, he is, as Peter Miskell has surmised, fully cognizant of his father's capacity for unwarranted violence. And after David's remarkable military successes and public popularity, Jonathan is surely aware that David is a potential contender in the struggle for royal power, a contest that customarily takes no prisoners. Moreover, Jonathan's initial protests may stem not from naivete, but from the constraints of his public surroundings and his social standing in relation to both Saul and David. The entire exchange is riddled with indicators of hierarchical distance between the two young men. David comes before Jonathan, petitioning him as a subject might petition a ruler. He speaks of having found favor with Jonathan, language that typically refers to a subordinate's good standing with one of higher rank. He alludes to himself as Jonathan's servant and appeals to the protection afforded by the covenant that Jonathan, as social superior, has initiated with him. This protocol suggests a public setting. Hence, as Keith Bodner notes, Jonathan's proposal that they go out into the field may be an attempt to escape the eyes and ears of the court. Once in a remote location, Jonathan ceases to defend his father and grows deadly serious, not only promising to protect David, but insisting that David swear to preserve Jonathan's life and those of his descendants when the tables are turned. In this revealing entreaty, Jonathan's love for David and his love of his own life form a perilous equation, tenuously balanced upon the oath repeatedly pressed upon David and upon Jonathan's knowledge of David's aptitude for decisive victories. Consequently, Jonathan invokes the name of Yahweh in multiple ways. In blessing upon David, may Yahweh be with you. 3 times as guarantor of David's success, may Yahweh seek out David's enemies. And twice as warning to David to keep his oath not to harm Jonathan or his family. Yahweh is between you and me forever. For his part, Jonathan leaves his friend hiding in the field and implements David's subterfuge to test his father's frame of mind. When Saul explodes at the announcement that Jonathan has permitted David to leave court in order to visit his family, we witness an outburst brimming with double entendre. "You son of perverse rebelliousness," he shouts at Jonathan. "Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be secure." The language of perversity, shame, and the choosing of another man is highly charged, especially given the dynastic implications of an heir apparent who chooses a male companion over the companionship of women. Saul's concerns are both personal and political. Jonathan's defense of David is met with his father's fortunately inaccurate spear. Jonathan leaves the table in anger and disgrace and returns to the field to report to David, who bows down to Jonathan repeatedly before taking his leave. But despite Saul's suggestive framing of his son's relationship to the son of Jesse, and despite tradition's insistence upon Jonathan's absolute loyalty to David, Jonathan ultimately does not cast his lot with David. The two do bid farewell, an occasion marked by kissing and weeping, until, the text reports suggestively, David grew large. a phrase usually translated innocuously as David wept longer. The exchange is, at this point, punctuated with Jonathan's solemn reminder to David of the oath sworn between them. Jonathan returns to his family, his father, his people, to continue the fight against the oppressive Philistines, under whom David will serve as mercenary. What we find here is an extremely nuanced gesture of friendship, one that pushes the boundaries of familial ties and ethical principles, one that navigates, and for the most part maintains, social and political differences, one that recognizes the complicated moral spectrum within the human heart. It is a relationship heavily burdened with questions regarding intent, with expressions of affection, at least on the part of Jonathan, with calculations for self-protection, with demands for justice. While traditional literature has endlessly rehearsed Saul's persecution of and Jonathan's loyalty to David, it seems to have missed what Jonathan's insistence on an oath and a covenant reveal about David, namely, that David's loyalty is in doubt, and David is capable of the same kind of injustice and unwarranted violence of which he accuses Saul, characteristics which will emerge more starkly as his story unfolds. As he does in chapter 14 on behalf of the people, and in chapter 19 on behalf of David, Jonathan here again pleads for justice, this time for his own family. Casting off the star-struck, chaotic mantle of tradition, he emerges, in the words of Diana Edelman, every bit a pragmatist. And as a proponent of justice, he is, perhaps of all the characters in the books of Samuel, the most fitting figure to be king. Sadly for the people, but to David's political good fortune, Jonathan dies in battle alongside his father atop Mount Gilboa. When David, only recently dismissed from Philistine service, receives the news, he writes a song, a lament eulogizing Saul and Jonathan. He sings it in public. He teaches it to the people of Judah, and he has it published in the hymnal. His lyrics offer an idealized portrait of father and son, mighty warriors, defenders of Israel. He ends the song with a special tribute to Jonathan. Distressed am I on account of you, my brother Jonathan. You were exceedingly pleasing to me. Your love to me was wonderful, more than the love of women. The accolade is curious, both for what it does say and for what it does not. Commensurate with his character thus far, David does not claim to have loved Jonathan. Indeed, in the course of the books of Samuel, David is never said to love anyone, though many are said to love him. Here, David sings only of Jonathan's love for him. We cannot help but note the political expediency of this. As an aspiring wannabe king, how best to help his audience with a transition to a new regime than to emphasize how much the former heir apparent had loved him. Moreover, Jonathan's love is explicitly compared to the love of women. Jonathan was pleasing to David, a word the sexual connotations of which are apparent in the Bible's most erotic book, the Song of Songs. Jonathan's love had exceeded the love of women. However, as David Gunn and I have noted, in the superlative, there is the obvious connection of Jonathan to women. If there is any speculation circulating about the relationship between the two men, this publicly performed and published song makes it clear to those who have ears to hear that in the relationship between Jonathan and David, Jonathan played the woman. As for David's oath not to destroy Jonathan's family, David does indeed preserve the life of Jonathan's disabled son, but he essentially puts him under house arrest so that his movements are always under surveillance. And as for the other men in Jonathan's family, they are curiously killed, one by one. So where does that leave us as we consider the work of biblical storytelling and the question of same-sex love? Throughout this iteration of Jonathan and David's story, I've been talking about and arguably blurring the lines between what the text is saying and what the text is doing. What I have hoped to demonstrate is that the language is richly nuanced and multifaceted, that the interpersonal relationships among the characters Saul, Jonathan, and David are personally, socially, and politically complex, and that there is more going on in these characters and events than first meets the eye. I've also hinted that the story is driven by at least one, and probably several, political agenda, and would have functioned as a narrative space where the ancient community would have gravitated to work through its various disagreements about such things as the wisdom or folly of monarchical rule, the ambivalent legacy of David and his lineage, the competing stories of David himself, lingering Benjaminite loyalties, the relationship between religion and politics, the institution of political patronage, the monarchy's dismantling of family and tribal authority, the nature of friendship and loyalty in a politically fraught world, and even the question of same-sex love. We should also bear in mind that the story of David and Jonathan is part of a larger story that ends in exile, and that undoubtedly was written to address that communal trauma. A community in crisis and quandary is, through this story, revisiting a critical moment of transition from judgeship to monarchy, from Saulide to Davidide leadership, asking, where did Israel's story go awry, and why? And what roles did the common people, the religious leadership, the political leadership, even God, play in this series of unfortunate events? What can be learned about human and divine nature here to help a traumatized community move forward? But these are questions that perhaps only interest scholars. Most contemporary readers are impatient with biblical texts that extend beyond a few verses, much less chapters or entire books. And they tend to be less interested in ancient politics and more eager to find immediate and personal relevance. So when we, as readers have throughout history, turn to this story for what it says about friendship in general and same-sex relationships in particular, we tend to gravitate toward textual details that speak to who we are and what we value. But if we read the full length of the text closely, we discover that what it says about such relationships is anything but simple and directly applicable. We are perhaps better off to think not in terms of what the text says than the work that it does. In effect, the story creates the space for a community to gather and to ask questions, a whole host of questions that can be inflected differently depending upon which character captures our focus. The character of Saul encourages us to ask, what do we have at stake when our children choose companions of the same gender? To what degree do cultural constructions of honor and shame drive our acceptance or rejection of such relationships? What traditional values are thrown into question, and how important are those? How do we understand such choices of partners to affect one's ability to lead and to care for people? The character of Jonathan generates a different set of questions. What does it mean to be a loving friend in a world of injustice and unequal privilege? How does one be a loving friend when there are conflicts of loyalties? When one's friend or lover is the enemy of one's family? When institutions are not constructed to accommodate such relationships? When others that we love are quick to shame, blame, and ridicule? How does one care for others and for the self at the same time? What purposes do covenants serve, and why might they be necessary? To what degree should loving friends be called upon to sacrifice themselves for another's ambition? How often do we, as loving friends, insist on justice for those who are persecuted? And the character of David prompts perhaps the most probing questions of all. How often do we bank on our status of being people after God's own heart, to benefit from the affections of others, only to stereotype them in public discourse? How different are our public and private lives? To what degree should we be bound by covenants not to betray, to destroy those who have loved us? As frustrating as it may be to those among us who would be much more comfortable with a singular meaning, a singular answer, a clear and unequivocal set of principles, examples, or models, the Bible takes a very different tactic to revelation. Its strategic multiplicities and ambiguities give biblical stories what Hilda Lindemann Nelson would call their wide explanatory power, their broad existential appeal, inviting all sorts of people and perspectives into their story worlds to take a look around and see if they can find themselves there. And, once having found themselves, find moral courage as well.